A flight of assumptions. Dr. Jada Reynolds closed her office door for the last time in what felt like forever. Her colleagues at New York General had practically staged an intervention, insisting she take time off after a grueling 3-month stretch of back-to-back surgeries. "Jada, you're burning out," her boss had warned, handing her the airline tickets to Miami. Now, for the first time in years, she was allowing herself a real vacation. Boarding the plane, Jada felt out of place, even in first class. She was dressed impeccably, her navy blazer crisp and her braids tied neatly into a bun, but the stares from some of the other passengers felt heavier than her carry-on. A stewardess offered her a smile, ushering her to her seat. Jada offered one in return, but her thoughts lingered on the discomfort she'd learned to ignore her whole life, the quiet scrutiny of being a black woman in spaces where people didn't think she belonged. Settling into her seat, she leaned back and exhaled. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a warm glow that made her dark skin appear radiant. This was her chance to breathe, to forget the tension of the ER and the constant proving of her worth. But relaxation seemed a fleeting dream. The seat next to her remained empty for a while, and she let herself hope it would stay that way. She had packed a book, downloaded a playlist, and even planned to watch a comedy film. But just as the flight attendants announced the final boarding call, a man in a cheap, wrinkled suit appeared. He was middle-aged, perhaps late 50s, with thinning gray hair and a sour expression. His poorly tailored attire was ill-suited to the confident arrogance he exuded. In his hand was a large, battered suitcase, far too big for the overhead compartment. "Excuse me, sir, let me help you store that," a flight attendant suggested, already sensing trouble. "I don't need help," the man barked, attempting to shove the suitcase into the compartment. The bag, clearly oversized, didn't budge. He struggled, grumbling under his breath about incompetent airlines and ridiculous rules. Jada hesitated, debating whether to intervene. She didn't owe him anything, especially after catching the dismissive glance he'd shot her earlier when he'd scanned the cabin. But kindness was her default setting, no matter how tired she felt. "Would you like some help?" she asked politely. He turned to her with a sneer. "No, I've got it." Her offer was met with the kind of disdain she'd seen many times before, an assumption that her gesture was somehow an insult rather than genuine goodwill. She leaned back in her seat, silently observing as the man's frustration grew. The flight attendant eventually returned and calmly informed him, "Sir, your bag doesn't meet the size requirements. We'll have to check it." "What?" he snapped, his voice carrying through the cabin. "I've been flying first class for years. This is outrageous." Ignoring his protests, the attendant tagged the bag and whisked it away. He plopped into the seat beside Jada, muttering to himself. His elbows jutted over the armrest, his presence encroaching on her space. "First class isn't what it used to be," he grumbled loudly, clearly directing his comment toward her. Jada straightened, offering a polite but firm response. "Airlines are just trying to follow safety protocols. It's not personal." He glanced at her, his eyes narrowing as if seeing her for the first time. His lips curled into a faint smirk. "What would you know about safety? You're not exactly in the airline business, are you?" Jada's muscles tensed, but her face remained calm. She had encountered men like this throughout her career, condescending, arrogant, quick to judge. "Actually, I'm a trauma surgeon," she said evenly, meeting his gaze. "Dr. Jada Reynolds." The man blinked, momentarily caught off guard, before retreating into a dismissive shrug. "Emph. Well, I suppose that explains the confidence," he muttered under his breath. Jada turned away, willing herself to focus on her book. The words blurred on the page as she tried to suppress the irritation simmering beneath her cool exterior. She reminded herself why she was here, to relax, not to engage with narrow-minded strangers. But as the plane prepared for takeoff, Jada couldn't help but wonder why interactions like this still stung after years of facing them. She thought about the long nights in med school, the grueling residencies, the countless lives she'd saved in the ER. None of it mattered to someone who looked at her and saw only the color of her skin. The hum of the engines grew louder, and the plane lifted into the sky. For now, Jada resolved to focus on herself, on the moments of peace she so desperately needed. But deep down, she had an uneasy feeling that this flight would be anything but restful. A crisis takes flight. The plane had been in the air for about an hour when the cabin began to settle into the usual mid-flight lull. Passengers reclined their seats, some with headphones plugged in, others flipping through in-flight magazines or scrolling on their tablets. Jada had managed to immerse herself in her book, a gripping novel she'd meant to start months ago but hadn't found the time. For the first time since boarding, she felt her shoulders ease. Her peace, however, was short-lived. From the front of the cabin, a sharp gasp pierced the air. Heads turned as a commotion began to ripple through the rows. Jada immediately straightened, her instincts kicking in. A flight attendant hurried past her aisle, her voice urgent but composed. "Sir, can you hear me?" Jada's heartbeat quickened. She craned her neck to see what was happening. A man in his late 60s, seated in one of the front rows, was slumped forward, his face pale and glistening with sweat. His chest heaved as he struggled to breathe, his hands clutching at the armrests as though trying to anchor himself. The flight attendants surrounded him, their voices a blend of calm instructions and mounting concern. "Sir, can you speak to us? Are you experiencing chest pain?" Jada didn't hesitate. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her book falling to the floor. Without a word to the man beside her, Travis, she recalled, she moved swiftly toward the scene. "I'm a doctor," she said, her voice cutting through the growing whispers of concerned passengers. The flight attendants immediately stepped aside, relief washing over their faces. Jada knelt beside the man, her mind switching to clinical mode. She introduced herself briefly to the man, though he was too weak to respond. His face was ashen, his breathing shallow and labored. Sweat drenched his collar. "Can someone grab the first aid kit?" she asked, her voice steady. "Do you have aspirin or nitroglycerin on board?" One of the flight attendants nodded, rushing to comply. Jada leaned closer to the man, her hand on his wrist to check his pulse. It was weak and rapid, a telltale sign. "He's having a heart attack," she announced to the attendants, who looked at her with wide eyes. Passengers began murmuring in hushed tones, some standing to get a better view, others peering nervously from their seats. The tension in the cabin was palpable, but Jada didn't let it distract her. The first aid kit arrived, and Jada immediately opened it, searching for the essentials. She found a small packet of aspirin and quickly unwrapped it. "Sir, I need you to chew this," she instructed, holding the pill to his lips. "It will help thin your blood and reduce the strain on your heart." The man nodded weakly, taking the pill and chewing it as she requested. She continued her assessment, instructing a nearby flight attendant to elevate the man's legs slightly to improve blood flow to his heart. A nurse seated a few rows back stepped forward to assist. Together, they worked efficiently, stabilizing the man as best they could with the limited resources available. Jada directed the nurse to monitor the man's vitals, while she used the intercom to communicate with the pilots. "This is Dr. Jada Reynolds. We have a medical emergency on board. The patient is stable for now, but will need immediate care upon landing. Please notify ground control to have paramedics ready." The captain's voice came over the intercom moments later, confirming the message and announcing to the passengers that the flight would be expedited for an emergency landing in Miami. Jada returned her attention to the man, who was now able to speak faintly. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "You're going to be okay," Jada assured him, her tone gentle but firm. "Just keep breathing steadily. Help is waiting for you when we land." Behind her, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes watching her every move. Among them was Travis, who had stood up at some point and was now leaning into the aisle to observe. His expression was unreadable, but Jada didn't have time to analyze it. The minutes stretched on as the plane began its descent. Jada remained by the man's side, offering words of reassurance and monitoring his condition. The nurse stayed close, assisting whenever needed. When the wheels finally touched down on the Miami runway, a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. Paramedics were already waiting at the gate, and Jada coordinated with them as they boarded to take over. She provided a detailed rundown of the man's symptoms, vitals, and the steps she had taken to stabilize him. As the paramedics wheeled the man off the plane, the passengers erupted into applause. Jada, caught off guard, felt her cheeks flush. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially outside the hospital. Making her way back to her seat, she realized her hands were trembling slightly from the adrenaline. She sat down, exhaling deeply, and finally allowed herself a moment to process what had just happened. But the silence beside her felt almost louder than the applause. Travis was staring at her, his mouth slightly open, as though he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The arrogant, dismissive demeanor he had displayed earlier was gone, replaced by something that looked like awe, and perhaps even shame. You're incredible," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Jada turned to him, her expression calm but unreadable. She was too exhausted to respond immediately, and the weight of his earlier remarks still lingered. Instead, she leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes and letting the moment settle. Travis's gaze lingered on her for a while longer before he finally looked away, lost in thought. The atmosphere between them had shifted, though Jada wasn't sure what would come of it. For now, she allowed herself to rest, knowing she had done everything she could to save a life. What she didn't know was how deeply this moment would affect not just the man whose life she'd saved, but the one seated beside her as well. Reflection and regret. The flight had landed, and paramedics had taken the man who suffered a heart attack to the awaiting ambulance. The cabin settled back into quiet murmurs as the passengers slowly realized the ordeal was over. For Dr. Jada Reynolds, however, the adrenaline coursing through her veins was still strong. She stared out of the window at the Miami skyline, trying to calm herself. The man's pale face and fragile state lingered in her mind, but the satisfaction of knowing she had saved him provided some solace. As she gazed outside, the sound of Travis clearing his throat pulled her back to the present. She turned to him, her expression neutral. But Travis started awkwardly, fumbling for words. His earlier confidence, or rather arrogance, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, his face was tinged with embarrassment. He wrung his hands nervously, his eyes darting away from hers. "I just wanted to say, thank you." Jada raised an eyebrow, her silence urging him to continue. "You saved that man's life," he went on, his voice quieter now. "It was impressive, remarkable, really." "Thank you," Jada replied simply, her tone polite but cool. Travis hesitated, sensing the undercurrent in her response. He scratched the back of his neck, his discomfort evident. "Look, about earlier, when I said what I said, I was out of line. I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to judge me," Jada interjected, her voice calm but firm. She tilted her head slightly, fixing him with a steady gaze. "Or you didn't mean to say it out loud." Travis opened his mouth, then closed it again. He seemed at a loss, caught in the trap of his own assumptions. I was wrong. Okay. I made some assumptions, and they weren't fair." Jada leaned back in her seat, her gaze unwavering. "Assumptions based on what? My skin color? My gender? The fact that I don't fit your idea of who belongs in first class?" Travis flinched at her directness but nodded slowly. "Yeah," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I guess so. And I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air between them. It was sincere, but Jada had heard words like these before. Apologies given out of shame, not understanding. She sighed, her exhaustion from the day making it harder to decide how to respond. "Do you know how many times I've been underestimated, Mr. Whitmore?" she asked, her tone softer now, but no less pointed. How many times I've had to work twice as hard to prove myself, just because someone couldn't see past their own bias. Travis shook his head, his expression somber. I spent my entire career saving lives, breaking through barriers, and yet there are still people like you who look at me and see what? Someone who doesn't belong. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. You say you're sorry, but do you understand what you're apologizing for? Travis swallowed hard, visibly struggling with her question. For the first time, he seemed to be confronting his own ignorance, and it wasn't an easy process. I don't know, he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. But I want to. I know I've got a lot to learn. Jetta studied him for a moment, gauging the sincerity in his words. There was something genuine in his tone, a crack in the wall of privilege and arrogance he built around himself. She decided to give him a chance. Learning starts with listening, she said. Listening to the people you've ignored, dismissed, or judged. It's not easy, and it's not comfortable, but it's necessary. If you're serious about changing, start there. Travis nodded, his face thoughtful. You're right, he said quietly. I spent too much time in my own bubble, thinking I had it all figured out. Today was eye-opening. Jada allowed a small smile to tug at the corners of her lips. Good. Change starts with awareness, but awareness alone isn't enough. It's what you do with it that matters. Their conversation was interrupted by a flight attendant, who approached with a tray of water bottles. Dr. Reynolds, she said with a warm smile, offering Jada a bottle, I just wanted to thank you for what you did. The way you handled everything, it was inspiring. Jada accepted the bottle with a nod of gratitude. Thank you. I was just doing my job. The attendant shook her head. No, you went above and beyond. Not everyone would step up like that, especially in such a high-stress situation. You've got a gift. As the attendant walked away, Travis watched her with a thoughtful expression. He turned back to Jada, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. How did you get into medicine? Jada blinked, surprised by the question. Why do you want to know? Because I want to understand, Travis replied earnestly. I mean it. I want to understand what drives someone like you. Someone who's obviously had to overcome so much to do what you do. Jada hesitated, considering his words. Finally, she sighed and leaned back in her seat. It wasn't an easy path. She began, her voice softer now. I grew up in a rough neighborhood, the kind of place where people don't expect you to succeed. But I had parents who believed in me, teachers who pushed me, and a stubborn streak that wouldn't let me quit. I wanted to make a difference, to prove that where you come from doesn't define where you can go. Travis listened intently, his expression thoughtful. And you did, he said after a moment. You've made a difference today, that's for sure. Jada allowed herself a small smile. Thank you. But making a difference isn't about one big moment. It's about showing up, day after day, and doing the work, even when it's hard, even when it feels like no one's watching. Travis nodded slowly, his gaze distant as he processed her words. For the first time since the flight began, the silence between them felt comfortable, almost reflective. As the plane taxied to the gate, Jada felt a sense of closure, not just for the emergency she'd handled, but for the conversation she'd had with Travis. He still had a long way to go, but maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a change. And as she gathered her belongings and prepared to disembark, she couldn't help but hope that the lessons of this flight would ripple far beyond the confines of the cabin. A chance encounter. The Miami airport was bustling, the hum of activity providing a stark contrast to the quiet reflection Jada had experienced during the flight's descent. As she stepped off the plane, her mind was still replaying the events of the last few hours, the emergency, the life she had saved, and the unexpected conversation with Travis. She pulled her carry-on along the carpeted terminal, ready to put the tense flight behind her. But as she reached the gate, she heard a voice calling her name. Dr. Reynolds. She turned to see Travis hurrying toward her, his face flushed from weaving through the crowd. His disheveled appearance, with his tie askew and his suit jacket bunched under one arm, was a far cry from the composed, condescending figure she had first encountered. Jada raised an eyebrow, unsure of what he wanted. "Mr. Whitmore," she greeted cautiously, "is there something I can help you with?" Travis hesitated, catching his breath. "I know you probably want to get on with your day," he said, his tone far humbler than before, "but I couldn't leave without saying something." Jada crossed her arms, waiting. "Look," he began, running a hand through his thinning hair, "I've been thinking about everything you said, about assumptions, about bias, about listening. And I want to do better. I mean it." Jada's expression softened slightly, though she remained guarded. "That's a good start," she replied. "But like I said on the plane, words are only the beginning. What matters is what you do next." Travis nodded fervently. "I know. And I've been thinking about that too. I run a company, a pretty big one, actually, and I've realized that some of the ways we operate might be part of the problem. I've never really thought about diversity or inclusion beyond the surface level, but now," he paused, his eyes searching hers, "now I see how much I've been blind to." Jada tilted her head, studying him. "And what are you planning to do about it?" "I want to make real changes," Travis said earnestly, "but I don't even know where to start. That's why I was hoping." He hesitated, looking almost sheepish. "I was hoping you might be willing to talk to me about it. Help me understand what needs to be done." Jada blinked, caught off guard by his request. She had expected an apology, perhaps even a promise to change, but she hadn't anticipated this level of humility, or this plea for guidance. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm a trauma surgeon," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "My expertise is in saving lives, not corporate reform." "I know," Travis said quickly, "and I'm not asking you to do the work for me. I just thought, well, you've opened my eyes to things I've ignored for too long. If there's any advice you could give me, or even resources you could recommend, I'd be grateful." Jada considered his words. There was sincerity in his tone, a genuine desire to learn and grow. She thought about all the times she had encountered people like him, people who had judged her, dismissed her, underestimated her. Most of them never acknowledged their bias, let alone sought to change it. This moment felt different. "All right," she said finally. "If you're serious about this, I'll give you some advice. First, educate yourself. There are plenty of books, articles, and talks by people who've been working on these issues for years. Listen to their voices, learn from their experiences." Travis nodded eagerly. "Absolutely. Any recommendations?" Jada pulled out her phone and typed a few titles into a note. She handed the phone to Travis, who took it with a look of determination. "Second," she continued, "look at your company's practices. Are you hiring diverse talent? Are you creating an environment where everyone feels valued and supported? If not, figure out why and fix it." Travis scribbled notes on a piece of paper he had pulled from his pocket, nodding vigorously. "And third," Jada added, her gaze steady, "don't make this about you. This isn't about easing your guilt or proving you're a good person. It's about doing the right thing, even when no one's watching." Travis looked up from his notes, his expression solemn. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'll do my best to live up to this." Jada gave him a small smile. "I hope you do. But remember, change takes time and effort. It's not a quick fix." "I understand," he said, his voice filled with determination. With that, Jada turned and resumed her walk through the terminal, leaving Travis standing there with his notes and his newfound resolve. She didn't look back, but she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope that their encounter might spark something meaningful. As she made her way toward baggage claim, Jada's phone buzzed. It was a text from her best friend, Kendra, who had been waiting to pick her up. "Kendra, girl, I'm here. Don't keep me waiting. Got the spa day booked already." Jada smiled for the first time in what felt like hours. A wave of relief washed over her as she realized her vacation was finally beginning. She could leave the stress of the hospital, the judgment of strangers, and even the intensity of the flight behind her, at least for a little while. But as she stepped outside and felt the warm Miami breeze on her skin, she couldn't shake the feeling that the events of the day weren't over. Whether it was Travis's potential transformation, the man she had saved, or something else entirely, she sensed that her impact on this journey would ripple further than she could imagine. For now, though, she was content to let those ripples spread on their own. A ripple effect. Jada found herself lost in thought as she waited at baggage claim. The day had already been more eventful than she'd planned. A man's life saved mid-flight, a profound conversation with someone she had initially dismissed as irredeemable, and now, the promise of a much-needed vacation. But something about Travis's words lingered. Was he truly capable of change? Could their brief encounter really influence him to take meaningful action? She shook her head slightly, trying to push the questions aside. People didn't change overnight, and it wasn't her responsibility to ensure they did. Still, a part of her wanted to believe that today had planted a seed in Travis, a spark of realization that might grow into something bigger. Her thoughts were interrupted when a young woman approached her hesitantly. "Excuse me, Dr. Reynolds." Jada turned, surprised. The woman, likely in her mid-20s, had wide, earnest eyes and clutched a carry-on bag to her chest. "I just wanted to say." The woman paused, her voice trembling slightly. "I was on the flight with you. I saw what you did for that man. It was amazing. Inspiring, really." Jada offered a modest smile. "Thank you. I was just doing what I'm trained to do." "No, it was more than that," the woman insisted. "The way you stayed calm, the way you took control, it made me realize how much impact one person can have. I'm a nursing student, and seeing you in action, it reminded me why I chose this path." Jada's smile widened, warmth spreading through her chest. "That's kind of you to say. Nursing is an incredible field, and we need more people like you in it. Keep going, even when it gets tough." The young woman nodded eagerly, her admiration clear. "I will. And thank you again, for everything." As the woman walked away, Jada felt a renewed sense of purpose. Moments like these reminded her why she had chosen such a demanding career. It wasn't just about the lives she saved. It was about the ripple effect, the way her actions could inspire others to make a difference in their own way. Her luggage finally appeared, and she grabbed it off the carousel. Just as she began wheeling it toward the exit, she spotted Travis again, standing near the edge of the terminal. He was on his phone, speaking animatedly. Jada considered ignoring him, but curiosity got the better of her. She slowed her pace, catching snippets of his conversation. "No, I mean it, Dave. We need to rethink the way we're doing things. It's not just about checking boxes anymore. We need real change, top to bottom." Jada paused, pretending to adjust her bag as she listened. "I know it won't be easy, but I saw something today that really opened my eyes. We've been blind to the kind of talent and perspective we're missing out on. I want a meeting with HR as soon as I'm back, and bring in that consultant we talked about. I want a full audit of our hiring practices." He ended the call and exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. When he looked up and saw Jada watching, his expression shifted from surprise to something more earnest. "Dr. Reynolds," he said, approaching her cautiously, "I wasn't expecting to see you again." "Neither was I," Jada admitted. She tilted her head, a hint of a smile on her lips. "You sounded motivated." Travis gave a sheepish chuckle. "I meant what I said earlier, about wanting to change. I just got off the phone with my COO, telling him we need to make some serious adjustments." "Actions speak louder than words," Jada said, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. "I know," he replied, his voice steady. "And I intend to follow through. Today wasn't just a wake-up call for me. It was a call to do better, not just as a person, but as a leader." Jada studied him for a moment, searching for any sign of insincerity. But to her surprise, she found none. "Well," she said finally, "good luck. Change isn't easy, but it's worth it. Travis nodded, his gaze thoughtful. Thank you. And Dr. Reynolds, if you ever find yourself in need of a new challenge, I'd be honored to have someone like you on my team. You're exactly the kind of leader we need more of in this world. Jada blinked, caught off guard by the offer. She laughed softly, shaking her head. I think I'll stick to saving lives for now, but I appreciate the sentiment. With that, she turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Travis behind. As she stepped outside and felt the warm Miami breeze on her skin, she allowed herself to finally relax. The chaos of the day was behind her, and the promise of a rejuvenating vacation lay ahead. But deep down, she knew the impact of her actions wouldn't end here. The ripples of what had happened on that flight would continue to spread, through Travis, through the nursing student, and perhaps even further than she could imagine. Jada smiled to herself, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Sometimes, the smallest actions could have the greatest impact, and today had been a powerful reminder of that truth. A quiet revolution. Jada had settled into her vacation routine with surprising ease. For the first time in months, she was waking up without an alarm clock, enjoying slow mornings with coffee on the balcony of her beachfront hotel, and indulging in long walks along the shore. The events of the flight were slowly fading into the background, replaced by the soothing rhythm of the ocean waves and the warmth of Miami's sun. But one morning, as she sipped her coffee and checked her emails, a subject line caught her eye. Thank you, Dr. Reynolds. Curious, she opened it. The email was from Travis Whitmore. Subject: Thank you, Dr. Reynolds. From Travis Whitmore. To Dr. Jada Reynolds. Dear Dr. Reynolds, I hope this message finds you well and enjoying your vacation. I wanted to express my gratitude again, not just for what you did on that flight, but for the perspective you shared with me. Since we parted ways, I've been reflecting deeply on our conversation. I realized that my ignorance has not only hurt others, but also limited the potential of the people I work with. As the CEO of a company with thousands of employees, I've come to see how my leadership, or lack thereof, can ripple outward, affecting lives in ways I hadn't considered. I wanted you to know that I've already begun taking steps to address the issues we discussed. We've hired a diversity and inclusion consultant to audit our practices, and I've scheduled a series of listening sessions with employees from all levels of the organization. I want to hear their stories, their challenges, their experiences, their ideas. I know this is only the beginning, but I'm committed to seeing it through. Your words on the flight sparked something in me, and I hope I can carry that forward in a way that honors the example you set. Thank you again for your honesty, your wisdom, and your courage. Sincerely, Travis Whitmore. Jada stared at the screen for a moment, letting the words sink in. She had expected Travis to try, perhaps to take a few initial steps before falling back into old habits. But this email felt different. It carried a sense of humility and determination that she hadn't anticipated. She set her coffee cup down and leaned back in her chair, her mind drifting to the conversation they'd had. It wasn't the first time she had confronted someone about their biases, but it was one of the few times she felt like her words had truly resonated. After a moment of contemplation, she hit reply. Subject: Thank you, Dr. Reynolds. From Dr. Jada Reynolds. To Travis Whitmore. Dear Mr. Whitmore, thank you for your message. I'm glad to hear you've taken our conversation to heart and are already taking steps to create meaningful change. It's not an easy journey, but the fact that you're willing to listen and learn is a strong foundation. The listening sessions you've planned sound like a great starting point. Remember, this process isn't about solving everything overnight. It's about building trust and creating an environment where people feel valued and heard. If you stay committed to this work and lead with empathy, I believe you can make a real difference, not just in your company, but in the lives of the people who work with you. Best of luck, and thank you for reaching out. Sincerely, Dr. Jada Reynolds. Hitting send, Jada felt a sense of closure. She had done her part. The rest was up to him. Later that evening, as Jada strolled along the beach, her phone buzzed with another message. This time, it wasn't from Travis, but from the young nursing student she had met at the airport. "Dr. Reynolds, I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I just wanted to share some exciting news. I was accepted into an advanced trauma nursing program. Meeting you on that flight reminded me of why I started this journey in the first place. Thank you for inspiring me to keep going." Jada smiled, the soft glow of the setting sun warming her face. The ripple effect was continuing, even in ways she hadn't expected. As she walked further down the shoreline, she reflected on how these seemingly small moments had created a quiet revolution, not just in Travis, not just in the nursing student, but within herself as well. The next day, as Jada sat by the pool with her best friend, Kendra, the conversation turned to the flight. Kendra listened intently as Jada recounted everything that had happened, from the emergency to her exchange with Travis. "Girl, you're always saving lives," Kendra said with a laugh, sipping her pina colada. "But this time, it sounds like you saved more than just that man's heart. You got Travis to look in the mirror, and that's no small feat." Jada chuckled, shaking her head. "I didn't save him. He's the one who has to do the work. I just gave him a nudge." Kendra raised an eyebrow. "A nudge? Jada, you handed him a reality check on a silver platter, and he took it. That's huge." Jada shrugged, though she couldn't deny the satisfaction she felt. "I guess, but honestly, I'm just glad he's trying. If more people did that, really tried to change, the world would be a better place." Kendra nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You know, maybe you should be doing more of this. Talking to people, shaking them out of their bubbles. You've got a gift, Jada. People listen to you." Jada smiled, but she shook her head. "My work is in the hospital, Kendra. That's where I'm meant to be." "For now," Kendra said with a knowing look. "But who knows what the future holds?" Jada didn't respond, but her friend's words stayed with her. The idea of creating change beyond the operating room had always seemed abstract, distant. But after the events of the flight, it didn't feel so far-fetched anymore. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Jada felt a sense of quiet contentment. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she was grateful for the journey so far. Sometimes, she thought, the greatest revolutions begin with the smallest ripples. The ripple becomes a wave. Jada's vacation had done wonders for her. By the time she returned to New York, she felt recharged and ready to dive back into the demanding pace of her work. Yet the events of the flight still lingered in her mind, resurfacing at odd moments. The ripple effects, the nursing student's determination, Travis's commitment to change, left her wondering about the broader impact of her words and actions. Her first day back at the hospital was typical of life in trauma surgery, chaotic, intense, and rewarding. Between back-to-back surgeries, Jada barely had time to eat, let alone think about anything outside of the ER. But as she was finishing her shift, her phone buzzed with a notification from her assistant, Caroline. "Dr. Reynolds, there's someone here asking to speak with you. Says it's important." Jada frowned, glancing at the clock. It was well past visiting hours, and she couldn't imagine who would show up unannounced. She replied quickly, "I'll be out in 5 minutes." When Jada stepped into the waiting area, she was surprised to see Travis Whitmore standing there, holding a folder and looking slightly out of place in the bustling hospital. He wore a tailored suit this time, one that actually fit him, and his expression was a mix of determination and nervousness. "Mr. Whitmore," Jada said, her tone cautious but polite. "This is unexpected." Travis smiled awkwardly, adjusting the folder in his hands. "I know, and I apologize for showing up unannounced, but I wanted to see you in person. It's important." Jada crossed her arms, studying him. "All right, let's talk." She led him to a quiet corner of the waiting area, gesturing for him to sit. Once seated, Travis handed her the folder. "This is the first step," he said. Jada opened it, her eyes scanning the documents inside. It was a detailed proposal, complete with plans for implementing diversity initiatives, mentorship programs for underrepresented groups, and a comprehensive audit of hiring and promotion practices. "This looks thorough," Jada said, raising an eyebrow as she flipped through the pages. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Travis replied, his voice steady. "After our conversation, I realized how blind I've been, to my own biases, to the systemic issues within my company, and to the incredible talent we've overlooked because of it. I've been working with consultants, employees, and leaders in the field to develop this plan. It's just the beginning, but I wanted you to see it." Jada looked up, her expression unreadable. "Why me?" "Because you're the one who opened my eyes," Travis said simply. "You didn't just save that man's life on the plane. You saved me from my own ignorance. I don't want this to be just another corporate initiative. I want it to mean something, and I thought you might have insights that could help." Jada leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. She had encountered plenty of people who talked about change, but rarely followed through. Travis's efforts seemed different, genuine. "You've made a strong start," she said after a moment. "But real change takes time. It's not just about programs and policies. It's about shifting culture, challenging assumptions, and holding people accountable. Are you ready for that?" Travis nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I am. And I'm willing to put in the work." Jada handed the folder back to him. "Then keep going. Listen to the people around you, especially those who've been marginalized. And don't be afraid to make mistakes, as long as you learn from them." Travis accepted the folder with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Dr. Reynolds, for everything." Jada stood, extending her hand. "Good luck, Mr. Whitmore." He shook her hand firmly, then left the hospital with a renewed sense of purpose. The following weeks passed in a blur of surgeries and patient care, but Jada couldn't help noticing subtle changes in her own outlook. She found herself paying closer attention to her colleagues' experiences, particularly those who came from backgrounds similar to hers. She began mentoring younger doctors more actively, sharing her journey and encouraging them to embrace their unique perspectives. One evening, as she was leaving the hospital, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a news article sent by Caroline, accompanied by a single line of text. "You're making headlines, Dr. Reynolds." Curious, Jada opened the link. The article was about Travis Whitmore's company, detailing the sweeping changes he had implemented since their flight. It highlighted new programs for mentorship, scholarships for underrepresented communities, and a shift in company culture that was already yielding results. The article also mentioned a certain trauma surgeon whose courage and candor had inspired the transformation. Jada stared at the screen, a mixture of pride and disbelief washing over her. She hadn't expected her brief encounter with Travis to lead to something so impactful. The ripple had indeed become a wave. A week later, Jada was invited to speak at a leadership conference in New York. The invitation came as a surprise. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight outside of the medical field, but she accepted, curious about what the experience would bring. On the day of the conference, she stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding as she faced an audience of CEOs, executives, and community leaders. She took a deep breath, her mind flashing back to the flight, to the man who had almost lost his life, and to the conversation that had changed the course of another's. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady. "I'm Dr. Jada Reynolds, and I'm here to talk about something that goes beyond medicine. It's about the power of listening, the courage to confront our biases, and the ripple effects of our actions." As she spoke, the room fell silent, captivated by her words. She shared her story, not just of the flight, but of her journey as a Black woman in a field where she often felt she had to fight for her place. She talked about the impact of small moments, of how a single conversation could spark a revolution. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Among the audience, she spotted Travis, standing and clapping with a look of genuine admiration. Jada stepped off the stage, feeling a sense of fulfillment she hadn't expected. She had always thought her work would be confined to the operating room, but now she realized her impact could extend far beyond it. Sometimes, she thought, the greatest waves begin with the smallest ripples, and today she was ready to ride them wherever they might lead. The conclusion. As the applause faded, Jada stepped off the stage, her heart still pounding. She wasn't accustomed to being in the spotlight like this. Her work had always been behind the scenes, in the sterile but life-saving environment of the operating room. Yet, standing before a room full of influential leaders, she realized how deeply her words had resonated. "Dr. Reynolds." A voice called from the side of the stage. It was Travis, weaving through the crowd to reach her. This time, his demeanor was completely transformed. The arrogance and condescension she had first encountered were long gone, replaced with a genuine warmth and respect. "That was incredible," he said, shaking her hand firmly. "You had everyone hanging on your every word." Jada smiled, feeling a small swell of pride. "Thank you, but it's not about me. It's about what people do with the message. And you've inspired action," Travis said earnestly, "not just in me, but in so many others. Our initiatives are gaining traction, and I'm seeing changes in how people approach leadership, hiring, and teamwork. It's a long road, but I wanted you to know it's working." Jada nodded, her smile growing. "I'm glad to hear that. But remember, it's a journey, not a destination. The work never really stops." Travis chuckled. "Believe me, I'm learning that." As they spoke, a young woman approached timidly. Jada recognized her immediately. It was the nursing student from the airport. "Dr. Reynolds," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "I didn't know you'd be speaking here. I just wanted to thank you again. I've started my advanced trauma program, and I can't tell you how much your example keeps me motivated." Jada's smile softened. "That's wonderful to hear. I'm so proud of you. Keep going. You're going to do amazing things." The young woman beamed, glancing at Travis before stepping back to let them continue their conversation. "You really do inspire people," Travis said, watching her leave. Jada shook her head modestly. "I just do my part, like everyone else should." "Maybe," Travis said thoughtfully, "but not everyone steps up the way you do. You've sparked something bigger than I think you realize." Over the following months, Jada noticed more signs of change. Articles about Travis's company began circulating, highlighting their innovative approaches to diversity and inclusion. Her hospital introduced new mentorship programs, inspired by her advocacy, and she found herself increasingly sought after to speak about leadership, resilience, and overcoming bias. At first, she resisted. Public speaking wasn't her comfort zone, and she worried it might take her focus away from her true calling, saving lives. But with each story she heard, each person who approached her to share how she'd inspired them, she realized this was another form of healing, another way to make an impact. Her days in the hospital remained as demanding as ever, but Jada found a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just a surgeon. She was a catalyst, a voice for change. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Jada sat in her office, catching up on emails. A familiar name popped up in her inbox: Travis Whitmore. Subject: "The ripple effect continues. Dear Dr. Reynolds, I hope this email finds you well. I wanted to share something that I thought might bring you a smile. Yesterday, I attended the opening ceremony of a scholarship program we launched for underprivileged students pursuing careers in STEM and medicine. The first recipient, a young woman named Alana, spoke about how seeing a Black woman like you in the medical field gave her the confidence to dream big. It reminded me of our flight and the moment that changed everything for me. I wanted you to know that the ripple effect you started is still spreading. Thank you again for being the spark. Sincerely, Travis." Jada leaned back in her chair, her eyes lingering on the email. She thought about the chain of events that had unfolded, starting with an unexpected encounter on a plane. What had begun as a tense, uncomfortable flight had turned into something far greater, a reminder that change often starts in the most unlikely places. As she closed her laptop and prepared to head home, Jada felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She couldn't control the world's biases or injustices, but she could confront them one moment, one conversation, one ripple at a time. Sometimes, the greatest revolutions began with the smallest acts of courage, and Jada was ready for whatever waves the future might bring.